Welcome to Hidden Pages, where we uncover the truth between the lines. Have you ever felt it? That deep, persistent ache for something more. A longing for a life not dictated by the whims of others, but shaped by your own hands. It's a universal human desire, a flicker of hope that one day, the world as it is can become the world as it should be. This yearning for change is the most potent force in history. It begins as a whisper in the heart, a silent dream of a future where justice is not a privilege, but a right, and where every voice, no matter how small, is heard. It's the dream of a world remade. Imagine a life where your every action is prescribed, your every effort measured not by its worth, but by the profit it generates for someone else. This was the reality on the farm. Each day began before the sun, a relentless cycle of labor under the watchful eye of a master who gave nothing and took everything. The air was thick with the stench of neglect and the silence of stifled dreams. Every creature knew their place, a hierarchy forged not by merit, but by brute force. To question was to invite punishment. To hope was an act of quiet rebellion. The fields, which should have been a symbol of life and sustenance, were instead a canvas of their suffering. They toiled, their bodies growing weary and their spirits slowly eroding, all for a promise of a peaceful retirement that rarely came. The farm was a prison without bars, a system designed to grind them down until nothing remained but obedience. This was life under the old master, a slow, grinding existence where the future was just a continuation of the bleak and unforgiving past. Then, a new voice emerged from the darkness, carrying a message that seemed to set the very air alight. It was a promise, as simple as it was revolutionary, a world where all are equal, a future free from the chains of the past, where the fruits of one's labor would belong to the laborer. The words painted a vivid picture of a tomorrow filled with abundance, dignity, and respect. No more would the strong prey on the weak. No more would they live in fear. Every animal, from the strongest horse to the smallest hen, would be a master of their own destiny. This wasn't just a promise of more food or less work. It was a promise of freedom. The idea was intoxicating, a powerful antidote to the despair that had poisoned their lives for so long. It was the dream they had dared not speak, now given voice, echoing through the barns and fields, planting a seed of possibility in the hearts of the oppressed. A new dawn was not just possible, it was within their grasp. The air crackled with a new energy. The once silent whispers of discontent grew into a unified chorus of defiance. The day came when the collective weight of their suffering became too much to bear. It was not a single moment, but a cascade of small rebellions that finally broke the dam. A gate left unlocked, a meal forgotten, a whip cracked one too many times. The master, so accustomed to absolute control, was caught off guard by the sudden, explosive release of years of pent-up rage. The revolution was swift, chaotic, and decisive. The tools of their oppression were shattered. The symbols of their servitude were torn down. The farmhouse, once a forbidden fortress of power, was stormed and reclaimed. In a matter of hours, the old world was gone, and the farm belonged to them. The air, once heavy with fear, was now filled with the triumphant sounds of liberation. They had done the impossible. They had overthrown their master. The long night was over, and a new day had begun. In the first light of this new era, a profound sense of unity washed over the farm. Former divisions melted away, replaced by a shared sense of purpose and a powerful wave of optimism. They worked together, not out of fear, but with a newfound pride. Every task, no matter how mundane, felt meaningful. They were no longer laboring for a master, but for themselves, for their community, for their future. Songs of freedom were sung in the fields. The 7 great commandments of their new society were painted in bold white letters on the barn wall, a constant reminder of the principles they had fought for. All animals are equal. It was a simple, beautiful truth. The harvest that year was the most successful they had ever known, a testament to their collective effort. There was a genuine belief that they were building a paradise, a society that would stand as a beacon of hope for all the oppressed creatures of the world. In those early days, anything felt possible. There is no force on earth more powerful than hope. It is the fuel that drives revolutions, the light that guides us through the darkest of times. For the animals on the farm, hope was everything. It was the vision of a future where their children would be born free, where their labor would build a better world, not just sustain an unjust one. Hope gave them the strength to endure hardship, the courage to face uncertainty, and the resilience to overcome obstacles. It transformed their suffering into a noble sacrifice, a down payment on a brighter tomorrow. When their muscles ached and their stomachs rumbled, it was hope that nourished their spirits. They held on to the promise of equality like a sacred text, believing with all their hearts that as long as they remained united and true to their principles, their dream could never be extinguished. It was this unwavering faith in the future that made the present bearable, even joyful. Hope was their shield, their banner, and their most sacred possession. But in the quiet corners of this new society, a subtle shift was occurring. While the masses were swept up in the euphoria of their newfound freedom, a new kind of power began to consolidate, not with whips and chains, but with words and ideas. Certain voices grew louder, more persuasive. The original principles, so clear and simple, began to be reinterpreted, amended, and subtly altered. Small privileges were claimed, justified as necessary for the good of all. The once vibrant debates grew quieter, replaced by a more unified, directed message. Doubts were dismissed as disloyalty. Questions were framed as a threat to their hard-won progress. A new hierarchy was forming, almost imperceptibly, built not on old forms of oppression, but on the control of information and the manipulation of their shared hope. A shadow was creeping over the farm, so faint at first that most did not even notice it. The promise of equality remained, but its meaning was beginning to change. Hope, once a force of liberation, was slowly being forged into a tool of control. It's a quiet warning, a historical truth, that the most fervent belief, the most righteous hope, is not, by itself, a guarantee of freedom. But hope is only the beginning. The dust of revolution had barely settled. From the chaos, leaders emerged, not by force, but by acclaim. They were the architects of this new dawn, their words painting a future of equality and shared prosperity. They were the ones who had articulated the dream, who had given voice to the silent suffering. And so, we entrusted them with our hopes. They were not rulers, they assured us, but stewards, servants of the common good. We saw in them not the ambition of the old masters, but the dedication of true believers. They spoke of sacrifice, of the hard road ahead, and we, inspired by their vision, pledged our loyalty. Their initial actions were laudable. They organized, they built, they planned. The farm began to heal. Production increased, and for the first time, a sense of collective ownership filled the air. They were the heroes of our story, and we celebrated them. We believed their rise was our own. In these early days, the promise was as bright as the morning sun. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the levers of control began to gather in fewer and fewer hands. It wasn't a seizure, it was a quiet consolidation, presented as a necessity for efficiency. Decisions once made in boisterous, open assemblies were now deliberated in closed committees. To spare you the tedious details, they would say, to allow you to focus on your vital work. Information, once a shared river, now flowed through guarded channels. The justification was always plausible, protecting strategic plans from enemies, streamlining communication, preventing confusion. Specialization, they called it. Certain minds were better suited for the complexities of governance. We, busy with the toil of the fields, accepted this. It seemed logical. Why should a plow horse debate trade policy? Why should a chicken understand logistics? We yielded our voice in small increments, believing it was for the greater good. Each step was so minor, so well explained, that we failed to see the path we were on. Power was becoming a private language, and we were slowly forgetting how to speak it. Then, the commandments, etched in stone and in our hearts, began to shift. It started with subtle amendments, footnotes added for clarification. An absolute prohibition became a conditional one. No animal shall sleep in a bed, evolved into, no animal shall sleep in a bed with sheets. The change was explained as a practical necessity. The leaders needed proper rest to manage the farm's affairs, to protect us all. It was for our benefit, they insisted. Soon, other foundational rules followed suit, their meanings twisted, their spirit hollowed out. What was once black and white dissolved into a murky grey. When some of us pointed to the original inscriptions, we were told our memories were faulty. We were reminded that leadership required flexibility, that rigid dogma was the tool of our former oppressors. The original principles, once our unshakable foundation, were becoming relics of a simpler, more naive time. They were inconvenient truths in a world of complex new realities. The rules were not protecting us anymore. They were being reshaped to protect them. With every altered rule, a new justification was born. Principles, once the bedrock of our society, were now treated as obstacles. Eloquent speeches replaced honest debate. Complex arguments, led with statistics we couldn't verify and logic we couldn't follow, were deployed to explain why the new way was, in fact, the original intention all along. The leaders' words became a powerful solvent, dissolving uncomfortable truths. They told us that our prosperity required difficult choices, that our ideals had to be tempered with pragmatism. They spoke of necessary evils and strategic compromises. To question these justifications was to be labeled naive, idealistic, or worse, a saboteur. Our shared history was rewritten, our victories reframed, our sacrifices recontextualized to fit the new narrative. They became masters of the story, and in their telling, every deviation from the path was not a betrayal, but a heroic act of leadership. Principles became whatever they needed them to be. The open forum, once a place of vibrant, if sometimes chaotic, discussion, fell silent. In its place, fear began to take root. A dissenting opinion was no longer just a different point of view. It was an act of disloyalty. Whispers replaced arguments. A sideways glance held more meaning than a public speech. Those who dared to ask pointed questions found themselves isolated, their work scrutinized, their loyalty publicly challenged. Neighbors began to watch neighbors, not for safety, but for signs of deviation. The leaders spoke of unity, but they cultivated suspicion. They warned of internal enemies, of traitors hiding in plain sight, seeking to undo all our progress. This pervasive threat, whether real or imagined, was the perfect tool. It made us cling to our protectors, to the very ones who defined the threat. Debate became a liability. Silence became a survival strategy. The marketplace of ideas was closed, boarded up, with fear standing guard at the door. The next step in the descent was the sanctification of authority. The leaders were no longer just administrators. They were symbols of the revolution itself. To question them was to question the entire foundation of our new world. Their decisions were not to be debated, but accepted. Their wisdom was not to be challenged, but revered. They fostered a cult of personality, not through overt demands for worship, but through a carefully constructed narrative of their own indispensability. They were the ones who carried the burden, who made the impossible sacrifices. They were the sole guardians of the flame. We were encouraged to show our gratitude, to express our unwavering support. Any failure was attributed to saboteurs or external forces. Any success was a direct result of their brilliant leadership. The line between the farm and its leaders blurred until it vanished entirely. Their survival became synonymous with our own. Their authority was no longer a responsibility granted by the people. It was an inherent quality, beyond question and beyond reproach. Finally, the rot was given a new name: protection. The luxuries the leaders afforded themselves, the better food, the softer beds, the lighter workloads, were not privileges, but necessities for our security. We need to keep our minds sharp, they explained. Our well-being is essential for the farm's survival. The growing bureaucracy, the layers of guards and administrators who answered only to them, was not a power structure, but a shield to protect the people from complexity and danger. The resources diverted for their comfort were framed as an investment in our collective safety. They were not enriching themselves, they were fortifying the very heart of the revolution. Secrecy was security. Privilege was a tool of statecraft. The growing gap between their lives and ours was not a sign of inequality, but a symbol of the heavy burden they shouldered on our behalf. Corruption, in its final, most insidious form, wore the mask of paternal care. They were not stealing from us. They were protecting us from ourselves. The farm had come full circle. The initial dream of liberation, of a world where all were equal and all contributed to the common good, had faded into a distant memory. The structures built to ensure freedom had become the instruments of control. The language of unity was used to enforce conformity. The promises of a better future were used to justify a bitter present. The cycle, it seemed, was unbreakable. The struggle against one master had only given rise to another, this one born from within, cloaked in the language of revolution. The very ideals that sparked the rebellion were now the chains that bound us. The farm was more productive than ever. The silos were full, but the spirit was empty. The victory was hollow. Power no longer serves the people. The first sign of the decay was subtle, almost unnoticeable. It began not with a grand decree, but with a whisper. A changed detail in a story. A date shifted. A number slightly altered. On Animal Farm, truth, once a solid and dependable thing, became flexible. It started with small adjustments to the 7 commandments. The pigs, who had appointed themselves the guardians of memory, would claim that the animals' recollections were faulty. "You have dreamed it," they would say, their voices smooth and reassuring. The records show otherwise. And since the pigs were the only ones who kept records, who could argue? A commandment that once read "No animal shall sleep in a bed" was amended in the dead of night. When Clover, her old eyes struggling to read, asked Muriel to check the wall, it now read "No animal shall sleep in a bed with sheets." The change was presented not as an alteration, but as a clarification, a simple correction of a long-held misunderstanding. The animals, plagued by doubt and the strain of their labor, began to question their own minds. Was it possible they had remembered it wrong all along? This initial bending of reality was the crucial first step. It created a fissure in the collective memory, a space where doubt could fester and a new, manufactured truth could be implanted. The farm's foundation, built on the solid rock of rebellion and shared ideals, was now shifting onto the soft, uncertain ground of manipulated fact. With the foundation of truth now pliable, the next step was to rebuild the past entirely. History, they discovered, was not a record of what happened, but a story to be told. And the pigs were the only storytellers. The heroic memory of Snowball, the architect of the windmill and a hero of the Battle of the Cowshed, began to tarnish. At first, it was just whispers. Squealer, with his darting eyes and persuasive manner, would gather the animals and speak of newly discovered documents. Documents that revealed Snowball's bravery was exaggerated, his motives questionable. Then, the narrative grew darker. Snowball wasn't just a flawed hero, he was a traitor from the very beginning. The Battle of the Cowshed wasn't his triumph, but a carefully planned attempt to sabotage the farm. Napoleon, on the other hand, was retrospectively painted as the true hero of the battle, his strategic genius single-handedly winning the day. The animals were bewildered. They remembered Snowball charging bravely, the pellets scoring his back. They remembered Napoleon being largely absent. But Squealer was relentless. He would describe the scenes with such vivid, convincing detail, leaping from side to side, that the fabricated images began to overlay their own faint memories. The rewriting of history wasn't just about glorifying the present regime. It was about erasing any alternative. If the past could be controlled, then no one could ever question the legitimacy of the present. The windmill, once Snowball's dream, became Napoleon's original, brilliant conception, stolen by the traitor. Every success was Napoleon's. Every failure was Snowball's lingering sabotage. The past became a weapon, reforged to serve the present. The corruption of truth and history required a new vocabulary. Language itself had to be reshaped to serve the new order. The pigs mastered the art of manipulation, twisting words until they lost their original meaning. The principle of all animals are equal remained, but a quiet addition appeared one day. But some animals are more equal than others. This absurd, contradictory statement was the pinnacle of their linguistic warfare. It was a sentence that simultaneously upheld and destroyed the core belief of the revolution. It created a mental fog, a space where logic could not penetrate. Words that once meant freedom and rebellion were now used to justify oppression. When the pigs began walking on 2 legs, a clear violation of the old creed, Squealer was ready. He taught the sheep a new chant: 4 legs good, 2 legs better. The bleating chorus drowned out any potential dissent, the rhythmic repetition short-circuiting critical thought. Rations were not reduced, they were readjusted. The pigs weren't taking more for themselves. They were engaged in essential administrative work that was too complex for the others to understand. This manipulation of language was a form of psychological enslavement. By controlling the words people used, the pigs controlled the thoughts they could have. It became impossible to articulate dissent when the very words needed to do so had been stripped of their meaning or inverted entirely. The farm was enclosed not just by fences, but by the invisible walls of a controlled vocabulary. Once the mind was clouded, the heart was next. Fear, a primal and powerful motivator, was weaponized with chilling efficiency. The threat was twofold, one from without and one from within. The outside world, personified by the humans like Mr. Jones, was a constant specter. Squealer would paint terrifying pictures of Jones's return, of the whips and chains and cruelty that awaited them if the pig's leadership were to falter for even a moment. "Surely, comrades," he would cry, his voice trembling with manufactured emotion, "you do not want Jones back?" This question became the ultimate silencer. No matter the hardship, no matter the injustice, the alternative was always presented as infinitely worse. This external threat justified every sacrifice, every tightening of control. But the more insidious fear was the one directed inward. The phantom of Snowball, the invisible enemy, was everywhere. Was a tool misplaced? Snowball had crept in at night. Did the harvest yield less than expected? Snowball had poisoned the fields. His name became a curse, an explanation for every misfortune. The dogs, Napoleon's private army, were the physical manifestation of this fear. Their menacing presence, their low growls, served as a constant reminder of the consequences of disobedience. Fear paralyzed the animals. It kept them working, kept them compliant, and most importantly, it kept them from trusting one another. A fearful population is a controllable one, too preoccupied with survival to dream of rebellion. To sustain this pervasive fear, a tangible enemy was essential. An abstract concept of betrayal is not enough. It needs a face. And so, Snowball was transformed from a fallen comrade into an omnipresent demon, the farm's ultimate scapegoat. He was no longer just a memory. He was an active saboteur, a mastermind of destruction lurking just beyond the hedges. This invention of a perpetual enemy was a stroke of strategic genius. It served multiple purposes. Firstly, it provided a simple explanation for any and all problems. The windmill collapsing wasn't due to poor design or thin walls. It was Snowball's work. This absolved the leadership of all responsibility and incompetence. Secondly, it created a powerful sense of unity through shared hatred. The animals, despite their own suffering and division, could always be brought together in their condemnation of the traitor. This manufactured unity disguised the real fractures within their society. Thirdly, it justified the increasing levels of security and surveillance. The brutal purges, the public confessions extracted by the dogs, were all presented as necessary measures to root out Snowball's secret agents. Animals who questioned Napoleon's decisions were quickly accused of being in league with the enemy. The charge was impossible to disprove. The enemy was invented, but the terror was real. By creating a phantom to fight, Napoleon ensured that the real oppressor was never seen. As the animal's ability to think critically was eroded by fear and linguistic manipulation, a new tool of control became dominant: repetition. Squealer understood that a lie, told often enough, begins to sound like the truth. Reasoning, which requires effort and a clear mind, was replaced by simple, endlessly repeated slogans. The sheep were the perfect instruments for this. Their bleating of 4 legs good, 2 legs better could erupt at any moment, strategically timed to drown out a difficult question or a murmur of dissent. The sheer volume and mind-numbing repetition made complex thought impossible. The 7 Commandments, once a detailed code of ethics, were eventually replaced by the single, paradoxical maxim: all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. This was repeated so often that its inherent absurdity faded, and it became an accepted piece of wisdom. Napoleon's greatness, Snowball's treachery, the necessity of the pig's privileges, these were not points to be argued, but facts to be chanted. The farm's daily life was punctuated by these refrains. They echoed from the barn walls, were repeated in speeches, and chanted by the flock. This constant barrage of simplistic messages bypassed the rational brain, appealing directly to a more primitive, tribal instinct. The animals no longer needed to reason. They only needed to remember the slogan. The rhythm of propaganda replaced the rhythm of thought. The final, most tragic stage of the transformation was reached when the oppressed began to champion their own oppression. The animals, their minds reshaped by years of propaganda, could no longer distinguish between their own well-being and the well-being of their leaders. Boxer, the embodiment of strength and loyalty, was the ultimate example. His personal mottos, "I will work harder" and "Napoleon is always right," became the guiding principles for many. Even as he was overworked to the point of collapse, his faith in the system remained unshaken. When he was finally sold to the knacker to be boiled down for glue, Squealer easily convinced the animals that he was being taken to a hospital in a van purchased by Napoleon's benevolence. The animals saw what they were told to see, not what was written on the side of the van. They had become so invested in the narrative of their success, so terrified of the alternative, that they willingly participated in their own deception. They would challenge their own memories before they would challenge Napoleon. They would police each other, reporting any sign of dissent as disloyalty. The pigs no longer needed to rely solely on the dogs for enforcement. The general population had internalized the rules. They defended the reduction of their own rations, celebrated the privileges of the pigs, and found pride in their servitude. They believed their slavery was freedom. At this point, control is complete. In the beginning, there was a promise. A single, powerful word that echoed through the fields and barns: equality. It was the spark that lit the flame of revolution, the ideal for which so much was sacrificed. But as the seasons turned on Animal Farm, this foundational principle began to erode, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. The extra milk, the windfall apples, small concessions justified by the demands of leadership. Then, special privileges became codified laws. The pigs moved into the farmhouse, sleeping in beds, a blatant violation of the original commandments. Soon, rations for the other animals were readjusted, always downwards, while the pigs grew fatter. The dream of a society where all were equal was dismantled piece by piece, replaced by a new, cynical maxim whispered into the wind: all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. The promise was broken. The word equality became a hollow echo, a ghost haunting the farm it was meant to liberate. Power, once a tool for the collective good, began to change its nature. It was no longer a responsibility to be shared, but a possession to be guarded. Napoleon, once a comrade, now stood apart, surrounded by his ferocious dogs, a living barrier between the ruler and the ruled. The spontaneous, passionate debates in the barn ceased, replaced by ceremonial gatherings where orders were issued and dissent was impossible. Elections became a distant memory, a relic of a naive past. Power was no longer granted by the animals. It was seized and held through fear. Napoleon was no longer just a leader. He was president, a title that implied permanence. The initial spirit of the revolution, a system where leaders served the people, was inverted. Now, the people served the leader. The farm's governance was no longer a fluid, democratic process. It had solidified, becoming a rigid, unchangeable hierarchy with Napoleon cemented at its apex. Power had become permanent. As the new hierarchy hardened, a vast section of the farm's population simply vanished from the narrative. The chickens, the sheep, the loyal horses, the very animals whose labor sustained the farm, became invisible. Their individual stories, their hopes, their suffering, were erased. They were no longer seen as individuals but as a collective resource, a faceless workforce. Their purpose was reduced to a single function: to work harder. The memory of their contributions to the revolution was systematically suppressed. Boxer, the strongest and most devoted worker, symbolized this tragic invisibility. After toiling to the point of collapse, he wasn't honored with the promised retirement. He was sold to the knacker, his life exchanged for a crate of whiskey for the pigs. His sacrifice, his entire existence, was deleted from the official history, replaced by a fabricated tale of a peaceful death. The oppressed, the true builders of the farm, had become ghosts in their own home, their voices silenced, their lives deemed expendable. The most chilling transformation was also the most profound. The pigs, the leaders of the rebellion against human tyranny, began to mirror the very enemy they had overthrown. It started with small affectations: drinking whiskey, sleeping in beds. Then, the changes accelerated. The pigs learned to walk on their hind legs, a grotesque parody of human posture. They carried whips, the ultimate symbol of their former oppression. Soon, they were wearing Mr. Jones's old clothes, unearthed from the back of a closet. The line between liberator and oppressor blurred, then vanished completely. One fateful evening, the other animals peered through the farmhouse window. Inside, they saw the pigs playing cards with human farmers from neighboring farms. Laughter and toasts filled the room. As the animals stared from pig to man, and from man to pig, and from pig to man again, a horrifying realization dawned. They could no longer tell which was which. The leaders had become indistinguishable from the enemies they once fought to destroy. Faced with this new reality, a strange and quiet acceptance settled over the farm. The relentless propaganda from Squealer, the constant threat from the dogs, and the sheer exhaustion from endless labor had worn down the animal spirit. The original commandments, painted in bold white letters on the barn wall, were secretly altered one by one until they justified every transgression of the pigs. The animals, their memories clouded and their will broken, began to doubt their own recollections. Was it always like this? Had they ever truly been free? The new normal, a life of hardship under the pigs' rule, became the only reality they knew. The revolutionary songs were banned, replaced with meaningless anthems praising Napoleon. The symbols of hope, like the flag with its hoof and horn, now represented a system of control. The society didn't just forget its past, it was forced to accept a rewritten version of it, a version where this new tyranny was not a betrayal, but an inevitable and even necessary state of being. And so, the cycle was complete. The farm had come full circle, arriving back at the very point from which it had started. A privileged elite ruled over a disenfranchised working class. The wealth generated by the many was enjoyed by the few. The tools of oppression, fear, propaganda, and violence were once again the primary instruments of governance. The names had changed, the faces were different, pig instead of man, but the structure of tyranny remained identical. The revolution, which had promised to shatter the old system, had merely served to replace one set of masters with another. The grand experiment in animal freedom had devolved into a perfect replica of the human despotism it sought to abolish. The wheel had turned, and the animals were right back where they began, trapped in the same oppressive cycle. What can we learn from this dark fable? It is a stark reminder that the architecture of oppression is tragically consistent. It shows us how noble ideals can be twisted into instruments of control, how the promise of equality can be warped to justify privilege. It demonstrates the corrosive nature of unchecked power and the way fear and misinformation can paralyze a society, making it accept the unacceptable. Animal Farm is a timeless allegory not because it predicts the future, but because it explains the present. It holds a mirror to our own world, forcing us to see the patterns of history repeating themselves in the headlines of today. It challenges us to remain vigilant, to question authority, and to remember that the price of freedom is eternal awareness. The story's final, haunting lesson is not one of despair, but a crucial warning. The revolution didn't fail. It succeeded for those in power.